And grab your Bible, head over to the book of Philemon. That's where we're reading here in the month of September. And imagine, Jeff, when we started Philemon, everybody's tuning into the podcast waiting for us to get to the question people have when you talk about the book of Philemon.
Yeah.
And that is the question of slavery.
Yeah, what's Paul going to do with this?
So we've already sort of summarized that the message of the book is you have a slave that's left his master under bad terms, perhaps run away, become a Christian, and now Paul is sending him back. And no matter what goes on to be said, we've talked about receive him no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother.
Right.
That's verse 16. Whatever you say about that, he's still sending a slave back to his master. And so what do you do with that? It also plays into a broader narrative that Bible critics have, and really critics of God have, that how can the Bible be true if, according to them, it endorses slavery? And they, of course, would point to Philemon as being an example of that. And even in the bigger picture, how could you believe in a God that would endorse slavery? So I think really, if you're going to be fair with Philemon, the question to answer about the book is, okay, so what about slavery? What do we do about that? I do think, and this goes back to something you and I have talked about many, many times, there is a logical flaw in using slavery as an argument against God.
Sure. And it goes back to the same whole thing of I can't believe in a God who'd send people to hell, or I can't believe in a God who wouldn't let, unscripturally divorced people remarry. The whole idea is...
Who wouldn't embrace homosexual lifestyle.
Who wouldn't embrace... Yeah. The whole idea is if there's something I don't like about what God allows or is even commanded, that must prove he can't be or can't exist. Whereas the logical fallacy, as we've talked about before, is... if God is God, he, by definition, can do whatever he pleases, and whether you and I like it or not has nothing to do with whether or not he can exist.
The evidence for the existence of God is of a whole nother category.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whatever God says about slavery, there is still fine-tuning in the universe and living things on planet Earth that all argue for an intelligent creator, regardless of what the creator is like. And so one might argue, I think the God of the Bible is a bad God.
Yeah.
But you can't argue that there is no God because you don't like
how he runs the world.
Right, exactly.
And again, that's just again, we forget how modern that is, that argument, because the Greeks and Romans didn't like their gods; they just feared them. But because they didn't like what their gods would do, at least in their mythologies, they didn't like what their gods were capable of. They couldn't exist because of that. They knew better than that. They the Bible talks about. They looked at nature, realized there's got to be something out there. We're just afraid of it. So the modern mindset that just because we don't like something, it can't be true, that is such a modern conceit.
And by the way, when we find ourselves at odds with God in that way, it seems to me that that's a great time to pause and think, not to jump to the conclusion that God is wrong. And so one of the frustrations I have about the whole slavery argument is that people they Google Bible passages about slavery
out of context and cherry pick.
They rip it out of context. They cherry pick it to make a point.
Yeah.
But they don't ever really study it. And I'm just going to tell you going into this, folks, Jeff and I are not going to cover all the bases on this. I mean, there's a lot to be said to develop a proper understanding from a biblical perspective about slavery. I would say this, and I think this is an important thing up front too. You cannot assume because because the Bible addresses a topic, or the Bible from God regulates a topic or behavior, necessarily implies God's approval. And I think that's what people do. When God gives instructions, for example, at the end of Colossians 3 about slaves and masters, that doesn't imply that God approves of that relationship existing. It's just regulating a reality in the world at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Or even I think about Jesus when he's being pushed about divorce by the Pharisees in Matthew 19, and they push him about, if because they're willing to make divorce almost like this virtue or this thing you can do positively, and they keep pushing. Why did Moses command divorce? They ask him in Matthew 19, and Jesus says, because of the hardness of your heart, God permitted it. In other words, it's not an act of virtue or honor for a man to do this to a woman. What God did in the law was regulate something, because your hardness of heart meant he knew you would do this anyways. So he at least wanted to protect women and put some guardrails around what you and your stubbornness were going to do anyhow. So it was hardly a mark of virtue or the fact that God was okay with divorce that God put that in the law. I think that's a great example of. So the truth of the matter is, God does make concessions to and this is important too, David, important distinction. God does make concessions to living in a fallen world. Now, he does not want his people individually to. That's why you and I should not be divorcing our wives or doing these other things. But God recognizes that collectively in a fallen world, collectively people are going to do certain things. Collectively, governments are going to do certain things. Collectively, in this case, people will be enslaved, because Jesus did not come in his first coming to solve all the world's current problems. So the fact that God recognizes that at the group level things go on, right, does not mean that God is okay with it. God is just acknowledging the world is broken.
And think about the reality of a slave. Well, even in this story, the reality for Onesimus was, if he is a runaway slave and he is caught,
he's in huge trouble.
The penalties would be terrible, even up to his death.
Correct.
And so the reality is that the instructions here would actually be for his good, even though the arrangement that exists may not be what God wants at all.
Right.
It's still whatever God says about slavery, Onesimus lived in a world where that exists, and he was one.
And it wasn't going to go away in that world when Paul's writing this in the first century. And so if Onesimus is caught, because that's the thing, the Roman authorities, the governing authorities have a vested interest in punishing runaway slaves, lest the whole system fall down. Right. So the fact that Onesimus is a Christian is not going to matter to any official who catches him or realizes what's going on. Right. And so that's the thing, is what we forget sometimes is we're balancing this, what individual Christians can do in a fallen world where the system itself is broken, and God is saying that there are certain things I'm acknowledging are broken in the world. Jesus is coming back a second time to fix this. The first coming did not fix the brokenness of these aspects of the world.
So the other thing that I think is really important for us to say about slavery in the context of Philemon is that not all slavery is the same. And
this is a huge point.
And I think when people read Philemon, we talk about reading through Western eyes.
Absolutely.
And that is understanding language as we have experienced or from what we have seen, when in reality, culturally, it may have looked very, very different back at that time. And so I think that people today, when they hear slavery, they think of antebellum slavery. They think about what was going on in this country.
Correct.
A little more than a century ago, and are repulsed by the idea that a Christian would treat another human being the way that slave masters in the South treated their slaves. And so I understand how people would be offended by that, and the temptation to read that into Philemon. But the truth is that the slavery of both Hebrew times and New Testament Greek times were very different than what we see today.
Yeah, I think, for starters, American eyes, because we do see it through this country's experience with slavery, this country racialized slavery. There was a racial ideology underneath slavery in this country. Ironically, we're still bearing some of the ugly fruit of that racial ideology to this day, which is also why it's such a touchy issue to this day.
Right.
There was a racialist ideology that justified, that undergirded the slavery of this country. certainly was racism in the ancient world. Don't misunderstand me what I'm about to say. Different groups looked at each other and assumed, superiority or inferiority. It wasn't necessarily based on skin color as ours was in this country. But in the ancient world, much, much more than anything the American experience involved, slavery was both a political and an economic issue, and underscoring economic. Now, yes, when you hear economic in the American South, you think it was the economics of cheap labor producing cheap cotton. But we mean something different when we talk about it was an economic issue,
right? Something we
in the ancient world. No, because the ancient world was a world of scarcity. You could starve to death in the ancient world.
And culture would let that happen.
And absolutely culture would let that happen.
You and your children.
You and your children. There were no, the Roman Empire was not generally offering food stamps.
No welfare safety net.
There was no social safety net. There was no social security when you got old. There was none of this. And so in a world of scarcity with no safety net, for a number of people, slavery became an economic issue. Some people actually chose to be slaves because the trade-off was starving to death. Now, let's be clear, not everybody did. I mean, that's where we get...
But I want to jump on that point because in Exodus 21, the law actually takes into account the possibility that somebody would want to choose to be a slave, which ought to clue us in immediately. This is not the kind of thing we're talking about that went on in this country in that dark part of our history. This is something fundamentally different.
For economic reasons, somebody might say it would be better to be a rich man's slave, where I know, though, if I am his slave, I will have a place to live, I will have food to eat, and I won't have to worry about the fact that I'm a poor guy with no land who's likely to starve to death.
Because I think we would say, why would anyone ever want to
Yeah, but we in our time have no idea what it's like to live in a world of scarcity where starving to death is a real option.
So if I could attach myself permanently to a wealthy landowner, herd owner who would provide me a comfortable place to live, provide food for me and my children, and that was going to be the work for the rest of my life.
And had a good reputation, by the way, was a good man, like Boaz in the book of Ruth.
And the alternative was to be thrown out there on my own and potentially not being able even to find food to eat. It's easy to understand why someone would have said, that's a better option for me. Listen, not happy options.
No, but it's a fallen world. It's a fallen world.
You could understand why people might say, you know what, I've got a good deal here.
Yeah.
This guy is good to me. This guy's going to feed me and take care of my family. Out there's a famine. We're going to starve to death. This is a better option.
Yeah. And then let's add another piece to the puzzle, too, about the difference in ancient slavery versus modern slavery. And again, why some people might even say this is a better option than my other alternatives. And it's this. Unlike racialized American slavery, where even you weren't supposed to teach your slaves to read and things like that, in the ancient world, slaves could have professions. They could be better educated than their masters. And in fact, some slaves were actually school teachers. They were tutors to the sons of their masters. They were highly educated. They could be doctors. They could be lawyers. That was the thing. So in in their world where honor and shame were key social categories, there could actually be honor in being the slave of a great man and yourself being well educated. Again, because there was not this, the racial component was not nearly as prevalent in ancient slavery. It could be as much economic or political. And so somebody who's highly educated, again, might decide it's better to be a slave and a tutor to a rich man's sons than be a scholar starving to death in the streets.
Exactly. And that really opens up, I think, a whole additional realm of thinking that needs to be considered. There were other reasons for slavery. For example, sometimes you were enslaved as a penalty for a crime.
That's right.
Which meant, you stole from this man.
Yeah.
And the way you pay your penalty is you go work for this man for a period of time. And I'm just sitting there thinking about that and thinking, is anyone going to argue that somehow that's a worse way to punish people than what we do today? We ship them off to some facility where they sit around all day and watch TV.
Yeah.
I'm thinking before we judge God and say, oh, this was all bad, this was terrible, I wonder if that might not be a better way to deal with a criminal. Say, hey, these people you stole from, you're going to go work for them for the next 5 years, pay off your debt to them, learn to work instead of steal. I wonder if people, honestly, you think that's better or worse than the current system?
Yeah. And then let's add one other thing too, or just about the differences ancient and modern, which is there were opportunities for slaves to become free in the ancient system too. And so even sometimes you'll, if you read your history, and even I think my memory serves, there's a place too in the Bible even where he talk about the freedmen. That's the thing, former slaves who had in some way achieved their freedom. There were avenues for some slaves to actually become free in the ancient system, because it wasn't a racialized system where one type of person is permanently, for racial reasons, deemed inferior and thus slave material. The system was not necessarily permanent as it was in the American system.
So all pointing to the fact that we need to be very careful about reading these words and interpreting them through our world and our understanding, because biblically speaking, there's a whole lot more that needs to be considered. It was a different kind of system than I think what our brain says when we see that word. So that'll hopefully answer some of the questions about slavery. We'll be glad to work on any others you can pass on to us that you might have about that. But consider that as you spend this week reading back through the letter to Philemon.